I hear from many of you who are thinking about becoming professional pilots, especially those of you making a midlife career change like I did. And there are some incredibly expensive mistakes people can make that can cost them months or even years. So today we're talking with Jason Blair about how to plan your pilot career the smart way, how to avoid medical surprises, choose between Part 61 and 141, what the restricted ATP really changes, and why airline hiring is getting more selective again. If you want a practical roadmap that helps you get hired quickly, this one's for you. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 415, we talked with Josh Harnagle, the COO of Redbird Flight, who talked about simulators and gave us a factory tour. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/415. And if you are new to this show, if you would take a moment right now and touch the subscribe key, or if you're using Spotify or the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And see if you know any of these people who've recently signed up to support the show via Patreon. I really appreciate these donations as they recur each month, much like a subscription to Netflix or any other online streaming service you use. My thanks to Krish Krithavasan, Michael Cobb, Brian Wormsley, and Angel Hernandez. And we also had some one-time donations via Venmo. My thanks to Brett West, Kevin Kelly, and also a donation via PayPal from Douglas Cole. Thanks so much for helping to support the show. And if you'd like to support the show, it's easy to do. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find 4 easy options: PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you donate, I'll read your name here on the show. And of course, whenever you buy a Lightspeed headset, Lightspeed will send a check to support Aviation News Talk, but only if you first go to this special link we've set up for you to get to their website. So if you'd like to upgrade your own headset or buy another one for a family member or passengers to take with you, head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed, which will take you to their website where you can make your purchase. And just a quick note to say that if things sound just a little different, yep, I'm on another trip. And so I'm recording from my hotel room. I'll be back pretty quickly. But just wanted to let you know that we're going to skip our updates because I've got a lot of things to do here. And we'll work on more of those next week. But in the meantime, let me tell you a little about Jason Blair. Jason's an FAA DPE, or Designated Pilot Examiner, who gives check rides to pilots. And he's also an active flight instructor. He writes for both flying and plane and pilot magazines. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he's served on a number of industry committees. And he's also one of our supporters who supports the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's our conversation with Jason Blair. Jason, welcome to the show. So great to have you back here again.
Glad to be back. It's a snowy Michigan day, which is pretty much what it's been doing for about the last 2 weeks at my house. I feel like we've been in hibernation. It's a good time to talk about flying, if not get it done today. But soon, very soon, we're going to go into spring flying mode here. Can't wait.
Well, these are the only kind of days I get to talk to you because you're so busy giving check rides on good weather days. So good that it's snowing up there.
Yeah, I got to have something good to do on the off days.
Indeed. So we've spent a lot of time over the past few years talking about check rides, and those are among our most popular episodes. But you're also a prolific book writer. You've got a new guide out called An Aviator's Field Guide to the Pilot Career Path from ASA. Tell us about some of the big time-wasting mistakes that you see people who are doing midlife career changes making if they're thinking about, oh, now I want to become a professional pilot. What kind of mistakes are they making, and what suggestions do you have right off the bat for them?
So good questions. And, this is certainly a little bit different than some of the stuff we've talked about in the past, but it ties right in, right? Because those check rides are a part of that career training path, which is exactly what the book was focused on doing, trying to help people navigate that path and avoid some of the pitfalls that slow them down along the way. And in the end, really, I guess the goal is to try and figure out where you want to be as that career pilot, whether it's an airline, a charter operation, maybe it's a Customs and Border Patrol pilot, maybe you're flying for the, wildlife management out in Montana, watching coyotes, whatever it happens to be, your goal is to try and figure out how to get to that end job you want as fast as possible through the training path. And if we really think about it, especially the airline side, if you miss a couple years here or there because you got slowed down, you're not really missing those earnings years in the beginning as much as you're going to miss those earnings years at the end. And a couple of hiccups here and there because you didn't plan that path can literally end up meaning millions of lost dollars in your career path. This is especially true for folks who are kind of midlife career changing, or maybe, you had life in the way and you couldn't learn to fly when you were 16 or 17 years old and had to work a little bit and earn some money to get there. Maybe even had a different career that you decided, boy, this just isn't anywhere near as much fun as flying might be. So your goal is to really plan that path out and figure out how you're going to get there. Really big pieces of that the book covers for any age starts with, make sure you know what's going to be in the medical process. For younger folks, it sometimes is less concerning as you haven't obviously many medical issues coming up, although it certainly comes up there too. If you've had ADHD issues or anything when you were younger, these are things you got to get ahead of. If you have any medical conditions that might be disqualifiers for second or first class medicals, you want to spend some time working on that ahead. You want to figure out where you're going to do your training. And this is a critical piece, right? Especially if you're a non-traditional student, if you're in your mid-20s or 30s and you're trying to work a job at the same time, going to a 4-year college may not be the right answer for you. You might have to do this training at a local FBO somewhere close, or you might take a gap in your work pathway and, save some money up or go get some financing and take 6 or 8 or 12 months and go through a highly condensed academy style training that's going to let you make that break in your career from one to hopefully that aviation career and get through the training. So you might pick a Part 141 school that's academy style. You might pick one that's an academy style that isn't 141. The book certainly talks about benefits of both of these and how you might choose which one is the best fit for you. And then we get from there, right? You get through the training process. We got to figure out what all the ratings and certificates you are going to need, and then try and figure out how are you going to get those first couple of jobs? What are the things that are going to be, make you stand out, make you hireable? It might be being a CFI for a while. It might be flying some aerial survey for a while. Whatever that happens to be, to try and get you the experience you're going to need for whatever that next job is, whether it's an airline, or, regional airline, maybe a first hire, maybe it's working as a CFI for a longer period of time. Maybe it's even gaining the experience to end up going and working as an FAA air safety inspector and working for the government, something like that too. So the book really is focused on trying to pick apart all of these little details in the career path for training side. You're gonna have to figure out where you want to go, and some things in the book do highlight potential options other than airlines. But your goal is to figure out how to navigate that career training path in the best way to make you then hireable for whatever career pilot job you're looking to end up doing at the end of your career, really. I mean, that's what we're shooting for, right? And I get sometimes this is hard. You think, boy, this is very daunting. I have a long ways to go, and I got to get these first steps done. But taking a little time to kind of plan out where you're targeting and where you want to end up is going to let you make those decisions along the way that make you more efficient, save you money, and save you time in that training path.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, which is someone who's looking for an airline career, and they know that when they're young, they definitely want to get to that job as quickly as possible, because certainly 30, 40 years from now, those are going to be $1 million years. And if it took you a few extra years to get there, you're going to be missing each of those $1 million years at the end of your career. Now, I think the challenge is greater for someone who might be midlife, they're 40, 50, even 60, and thinking, I always wanted to fly for the airlines, or I always wanted to fly jets for charter or something like that. Now, the medical seems like that's got to be one of the biggest hurdles for them. What suggestions do you have for someone who hits a road bump along the way? They find they've got some kind of medical surprise.
So I think the biggest thing I'm going to tell people is don't give up. There are a lot of things that are very manageable. The air surgeon here in the FAA has done a lot of work over the last few years to expedite some of these processes that before used to take months and months to get through. It is a really good idea if you have something that might be a hiccup to get ahead of it and work with a senior AME, Airman's Medical Examiner. That way, when you do submit any packets, especially if you need a special issuance medical, that those packets are going to be complete and full and get the information to the FAA that they're going to need to make decisions. I've had a lot of pilots that I've worked with and known who've had medical hiccups. I mean, everything from a motorcycle accident and head trauma that delayed a friend's career for almost 3 years. Now, the key is he didn't give up. He worked on it and went through a lot of testing and a lot of proving, but he's now flying for a major airline too. And it, kind of hiccup for a couple of years for him, but he got there. And the one thing, and this is something which you talk about in the book, that especially for younger folks, but anybody, drugs and alcohol, boy, what a bad idea. You cannot afford to end up with that DUI or any drug history that's in there. That is going to be a big career hiccup. In a strange twist of life, I actually went through field sobriety test training with our local sheriff's department a couple of weeks ago. And what I found really interesting too is, if you are asked by a law enforcement officer, hey, let's do the field sobriety test, walk the line, and there's some eye tests and stuff, and you say, boy, I don't want to do that. Give me the breathalyzer. Well, technically, you've actually refused the test, and the FAA looks at even refusing being tested something that can be intermedical. Something people don't think about also. Even if you got yourself an MIP, minors in possession, as a young kid, or you had a DUI and it was 10 years ago and it's cleared and the FAA gave you your medical back, you may not be able to fly to Canada. Well, a lot of the airlines you want to go work for do fly to Canada. So, the alcohol side of the medical and the drug side of the medical, and we know a lot of states now have legalized marijuana, things like that, but these are federal no-nos. And first of all, you got to answer truthfully on your medicals. Do not lie about it, because that stuff does come up when they do driver's record backup checks, and make sure that's clear. So, if I can give anybody advice on medicals, if you're going to have any alcohol, do it at home. Don't drive anywhere. Stay there, and just don't let that be an option, or you're going to have a big hiccup to go through. Loss of consciousness, always a big one. If you've got that, we've got a gentleman I'm working with right now that, very carefully is navigating. He had a snowmobile accident. And unfortunately, the EMT, when they arrived, wrote in the report, cannot guarantee the individual had not lost consciousness, because it was, shortly after they got there. He's fighting through right now. Were you conscious? Were you not? Was there an issue? And he remembers the whole darn thing, unfortunately, but because that's in the record. So your medical records need to be really something that you focus on. If you have any hiccups in there, sit down with an AME. AOPA is an organization that does have a medical services branch that you can work with there. They've got some folks that can help get ahead of this stuff. For most of us, especially younger pilots, we're in pretty good health and things aren't too big of a problem. But there are a lot of things you can work through. I mean, I did a check ride for a student a couple of years ago who's on an app monitored glucose monitor. She's got a pack that just, these are things that 20 years ago, she probably would have been boxed out of being a commercial pilot. But now we've got cooler technology and stuff that lets them do that. So, get ahead of the medical stuff if you have anything. Do not apply for officially or submit that medical if you have questions, unless you've worked with somebody and you think you have most of it managed already. Don't submit a packet that you think is going to get rejected. Submit a packet that you think is likely to be approved. If you do get a rejection, and this is something that Susan Northrup at the FAA will tell everybody every day of the week, please respond to the FAA when they ask you for things. Many of the medical horror stories that we hear about taking a year, 2 years, are not necessarily because the FAA is taking so long. It's because they've sent information back to the AME or to the individuals looking for their medical, and they have not responded. They've not completed the tests that have been asked for, things like that. So make sure you understand, if you do have something come back, what they're asking for, and get it back to them in a timely fashion so the FAA can continue that evaluation and processing too.
Yeah, I agree. AOP is an excellent resource. I'm constantly sending people to them to talk with them to figure out what kinds of issues there are related to the medical that they need to do. And I just recently ran into a pilot who had to change AMEs because his previous one retired, and everything that he had done previously no longer worked at this particular doctor. And it turns out that I think if he had talked to AOPA ahead of time, that they might have been able to flag the issue and kind of prepped him a little bit better for that. So yeah, always a great resource. Of course, there are if you really get deep into something and need some help, there's some companies in Oklahoma City that'll help guide you through
We kind of call it pre-flight your medico, right? Make sure before you start that you've got it. And there are some AMEs that work with different conditions more effectively and more currently than others. We have one doctor here in Michigan that I know that's really good with what they call the HEMS program. If somebody's had alcohol or drugs, he's probably the guy to go work it. We have another one who's really good with ADHD issues. I know another one who is literally a neuro doctor, and he's really good with working with head trauma stuff. So, if you have something that's specific, don't necessarily just pick the average AME out of the box. Find one that focuses on the conditions that you have to work with.
We'll talk a little bit about the pilot record database. I think in the past, people kind of thought, well, check ride failures, not a big deal. Not so true anymore.
So not true. And then I guess we'll dive into a little bit of pilot hiring scaremongering here, right? In 2025, I think a lot of people got a little nervous that airline hiring went down, and it did for a little bit compared to 2022 and 2023, which were monster years of hiring. I mean, we were seeing, some of the big airlines hiring more than they've ever hired before. And I actually track some of this stuff. And what we've found with a lot of data from FAPA is that 2025 numbers really kind of just normalized back to what we saw in 2017 through 2020 before, COVID hit. After COVID, we had a lot of airline captains take early retirements and retire out. Now, we've certainly got a lot of senior airline captains that are going to hire between now and 2030. As a matter of fact, some estimates look at 2030 might be our biggest attrition year coming up. Like half the airline pilots at some of the majors are over the age of 55. Well, you do the math, in the next 10 years, by the time they hit 65, they've got to retire, which means for those thinking about this career path, there's going to be jobs. And when we look at the airlines, the majors pull it from the regionals hire from CFIs, and they bring them up. So everybody got a little bit nervous in 2025 when they saw the hiring drop off. I actually think we're going to see 2026 come up a little bit again. We're starting to see some indications of that, and that's a good thing, right? So as we track ATP pilot certificate issuances, we issued about 7,000 or 8,000 over the last few years on average, or a couple of years that were up from that. And most of those pilots get that training at the regional airlines where they complete an ATP-CTP course, and then they get their ATP with their type rating. Why am I saying all this? Well, because it means in 2022 and 2023, we were feverishly hiring, right? I mean, if you met the requirements, you were probably getting an interview, and hopefully you got through it unless you were the worst of the worst. We saw people with, more failures than average get through than historic numbers. That's not going to happen anymore. So what I'm going to call discriminatory hiring is beginning again. It sounds like a scary word. It doesn't mean we're hiring based on sex or race or anything like that. But what it does mean is the airlines are becoming more discriminatory in their hiring process. They're looking at how many failures did you have? Sometimes they're even asking questions if you were CFI. How were your students doing when you signed them off for check rides? Did you have good grades if you were at a college? Are there extracurricular things you're doing that are making you a better candidate for their hiring? Are you working with the FAA safety team? Have you attended some extra trainings? Did you maybe get a tailwheel rating and get a little extra experience? Have you been working with some mentors? These are great folks. In a lot of the airlines, you can work with folks that are working at those airlines, and they'll be mentors toward you. Are you part of some of the pathway programs that they have? Many of the airlines are looking at these pathway programs as preferential hiring locations right now because they're pushing people through that are coming through programs that they're familiar with, and then they don't sometimes have to do interviews. They get to flow right up. These are things that are going to show up in your airline interviews. It's going to show up in your pilot record database. I mean, obviously, you have a bunch of accidents and incidents. You're probably out. But I've got a good friend of mine that works with, a cargo carrier, and she's a screener. And boy, I mean, it doesn't take very long for her to say that one's out when they call and I have 7 failed check rides and 2 DUIs. Thanks for your application. Not even certain why you sent it here, right? So, thinking about what you look like as a package for potential hiring is something that makes a difference in whether you're going to move through into a career path faster. Now, does that mean if you've got 3 failures, you can't be a pilot and you're out of the airlines forever? Absolutely not. What it means is you're going to want to have a good story for what happened there and what you did to make yourself better as a pilot after the event, right? So what I tell folks all the time is, understand what the learning event was from any check ride failures and be able to explain that when you talk with somebody in an interview. I'll tell you from my own instrument rating, I remember being a full-scale deflection on a VOR approach in Wausau, Wisconsin. Okay, Wisconsin is pretty flat, but there is a large hill in Wausau, and it does have probably the largest tower in the middle of Wisconsin. I'll never forget the examiner, Duffy Geyer, saying, well, son, maybe you should take that hood off and avoid hitting the biggest tower on the only hill in Wisconsin, right? So I took the hood off at, 18 years old and looked at that and was like, wow, I was full scale. I'm thinking he's not going to notice, and I'm just hoping, right? I'm hanging on from the tail of the airplane at this moment. What I learned from that? Well, I learned when you go full scale, you got to go miss, be the pilot, do something about it. So if I have to answer that question, I'm not going to say, well, the examiner was just a mean old examiner. I did something wrong. How do I not do it again? And I've kept that in my mind ever since as a pilot. If I'm going full scale deflection, I need to find a way to get back onto a protected part of that approach path, get climbing, get missed, get to miss, and do it again. So, if you can explain, if you have any check ride failures, what happened, how you learned from it, and what you're going to do to make yourself a better pilot for that professional pilot job, whether it's an airline, a corporate endeavor, whatever it happens to be, they're looking at somebody who understands how to continue learning. And they know as you go through their training process, you're going to make mistakes too. When you get into simulators, they're going to probably load you up to the point where you're going to crash the darn airplane in the sim. And that's, task saturation is going to happen, learning is going to happen. And what they want you to do is learn from it. So as you go through your training path, make sure any negative events are something you can explain, and explain how you learned from it to make yourself a better candidate going forward. And, think about all of the things you can do in your training. We know training's tasking, and there's a lot going on, but how can you make yourself a better future interview candidate? And sometimes just, being the person that can explain that and have a better story is going to make you stand out in an interview also.
Yeah, I think continue learning is great advice for all pilots, whether you plan to get paid to fly. You still want to consider yourself a professional pilot because you fly well. I had a Vision Jet trip to Southern California 2 days ago, a day trip down in the morning, back in the evening. And afterwards I thought about, all right, what were the things that could have possibly gone better? And I identified, two little things that, yes, I dealt with at the time. And I thought, okay, in the future, this is a good place where I might want to slow down because it's going to give me a little bit of extra time. This way, if I end up slightly high on the glide slope, I don't have to worry about going down to try and catch it. And it just happened to be that going into that location in Southern California, hey, they slam dunk you. So it makes sense to be slowed up a little bit so you don't end up high. Talk a little bit about the choice between Part 141 and Part 61 schools. What should people be thinking about as they make that decision?
So this is an interesting question and something to dig deep into. And I can't tell you one is better than the other, but they are slightly different, and one or the other may be a better fit for you, depending on where you're at in your career, in your training goals, things like that. So, one of the things that we do get with 141 training programs is reduced hours requirements. And that's the main kind of benefit there. For most 141 programs, the difference in hours to the private pilot certificate is not significantly large. Where we start to see it is when we have the reduced cross-country hours in the instrument rating, and then finally for the commercial pilot certificate. So, I work with a couple of universities, and we regularly will see people get their commercial initial certificate in 180 to 200 hours. If you do that as a Part 61 training program, you're going to probably be more like 260 to 270 on average. And I've actually got data on that from 8710s that I've done on lots and lots of check rides over the years. It kind of proves that out. So you will be at more hours when you get to your commercial certificate in a 61 program. Now, the 141, though, assumes you're going to continue through that program. Maybe it's a college, maybe it's a training provider that has 141. I will say the benefit of going 141 is greater if you're going to go through a full private instrument and commercial syllabus, because that's where you really kind of get that hours minimum. If you're just doing it for the private pilot, the difference isn't that much. There's some additional flexibility in the 61 training. When you do the 141 programs, they're going to have a very strict training course outline, specific lessons that they go through, and many times even specific places that the pilots fly to. It's not as open as it is if you're going to be doing a 61 where you might just choose to fly to a different airport because Aunt Gertrude lives there instead, and you want to stop and see her for a bit. These are things that kind of show up in the differences in there.
Well, all of my training has been Part 61, so I'm less familiar with Part 141. Is there an advantage for someone who is perhaps working a career number one to using 61, more flexibility for scheduling flight lessons than there might be for Part 141 for someone who's not working and has lots of time available to go to school continuously?
That can certainly be the case, especially for folks who are training at local airports, local FBOs, or training providers. Getting into that 141 process can be a little bit more structured and require a little bit more flexibility in your time. The 61 realm is a little bit more a la carte is probably the best way to think about it. And you can kind of pick and choose as you go through. And there's nothing wrong with taking your time and going through the training process for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Matter of fact, I did a check ride for a guy who finally got his private pilot certificate when he was 78 a couple years ago. Obviously, we'd like to not have that big of a gap if you want a career path, but you can pick at this as you want to go. There's nobody that's telling you have to have it done in a certain period of time. It does improve your training proficiency if you can do it somewhat regularly. But there are a lot of folks that do evenings and weekends trainings, and that typically fits a little bit better in the 61 realm of training than it does the 141 more structured realm.
Let's talk a little bit about the restricted ATP versus the regular straight ATP, and also talk about how that plays into the whole Part 61, 141 question.
A really good question, Max. And this is interesting. I think a lot of folks in our industry think that most of our career pilots come from the universities. And we have numbers that tell us that's not the case. In fact, as we started in 2013 with having the restricted ATP, it kind of ramped up. And what we found is it's kind of leveled off at about 30% of our ATP certificates are issued as restricted ATPs. Now, a restricted ATP is one that means somebody has gone through a collegiate aviation program, either 2 or 4 year, or in some cases, actually the military, they're eligible for restricted ATP also. And that gets them an hours reduction in their ATP requirements, either down to 1,250 hours if they're at a 2-year degreed program, 1,000 hours if they're at a 4-year degreed program, and then 750 if they went through the military training for aviation. What that means is there's somebody that can go to an airline with less total flight hours because they've gone through a university, a collegiate accredited aviation program that is 141 certificated also. And the FAA's got a list out there of these. There's quite a few of them, but it means you've got to go through that program. And what that, gets somebody is faster to the airline in terms of hours experience. Now, many times we see people go through non-collegiate programs and finish all of their training certificates, private instrument, commercial multi, even CFI sometimes in 6 or 8 months in some cases at some of the academy style. So they can get through the training quicker than they might be able to get through a 2 or 4 year degree program. But then they have to go out and build flight time experiencing, somehow to get that time up to the 1,500 if they're a non-collegiate, non-restricted ATP eligible program. So they got to get, an extra 500, maybe 250 hours, depending on the program they're at. So that restricted ATP lets people get to the 1,500 hour equivalent, the restricted version, and fly as an FO in an airline sooner than they would if they went through the 61 training program. Now, they can't be captain yet, but they're going to gain experience once they get to that airline job, whatever it happens to be. Now, we see many of the charter programs out there that people are flying in have higher 135 minimums. So this really doesn't affect them very much there in terms of that pathway. A key point here is if you do your private pilot certificate ahead, and we see a lot of folks do this. I work with a high school. Every year we turn out 26 or 28 private pilots in their senior year of high school, which is super cool, right? And then they go on to other places. The key there is you cannot have gone beyond your private pilot certificate in a 141 collegiate program and qualify for the restricted ATP minimums. So if somebody's thinking, hey, I'm going to get ahead of this, do my private and my instrument, and then go to college X, and I'm going to get my R-ATP. By doing anything from the instrument above, you actually disqualify yourself for the ATP restricted allowance. So, something to think about if somebody's got family or friends that are younger, or they're looking to go into this, and they think, hey, I'll get a leg up and then I'll get my degree in a collegiate program. That 141 requires you to go through some portions of it. Really, the instrument and the commercial have to be done in their program to account for the restricted ATPs.
In recent years, a lot of people have waited until they got hired by the airlines to get their ATP, and the airlines have been willing to pay for some of the more expensive parts of the ATP, including the Level D simulator training. What's the best advice these days for people? Should they go ahead and go out of pocket and get that training themselves so that they show up at their interview, they already have the ATP, or is it still possible to show up and let the airlines pay for that for you?
So it's still possible to show up and have them, pay for that for you. Most of the airline hiring programs in the regional airlines are structured so that the ATP-CTP course that is a prerequisite for getting that ATP are now incorporated in those training programs. They know a lot of folks are going to come out needing the hours and then need to get that course and complete their ATP. And they do that at the same time as they do their type rating in the CRJ or ERJ or Airbus or whatever it happens to be at this point. So those are kind of structured into that. As we think about hiring when we are a little bit more, picky, that may be something that somebody would want to consider. And I'll be honest, when we first started doing this in the beginning, we thought those ATP-CTP courses were going to be $20,000 or $30,000, and we've seen them really come down in price. A lot of places have gotten efficient with this, and we're seeing $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. That can be a good investment if you meet all of the ATP minimums. That could be something that would separate you out as a candidate for potentially, going to an airline. Now, what I will say is I think there is some anecdotal evidence that, let's say you've flown for a while, you're a midlife career, you've been a pilot, maybe you're an instructor for a while, and you thought, it's finally time I want to jump up to the airline. And let's say you're at higher experience. Maybe you flew corporate for a while, you flew personal 91 for somebody for a while, and you flew a bigger airplane. You might be able to make that jump directly to a major airline without going to the regional airlines. A couple great examples I've seen of this are one friend actually flew for the FAA as a flight check pilot, flew a lot of King Air time, and he went straight from there to a major cargo carrier and didn't go to an airline. I've got another friend that did the same job. Actually, he went to a major airline. A couple others that have flown some cargo flying and then, smaller aircraft. One did a short 360 for a lot of years, and he jumped right over to United. So, didn't necessarily have that ATP certificate in the job they were doing as corporate and charter type pilots, but they had more experience, right? And so in a case like that, imagine you're a mid-life career changer, especially if you're 30s and 40s, and you got a bunch of flight time, maybe you're at 4,000 or 5,000 hours and you've got some multi-time. Getting that type rating kind of kicked off by getting your ATP-CTP done might be something that lets you jump the line a little bit and go right to a major airline.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that people might do to help differentiate themselves from others so that they stand out in the hiring effort. So talk about some of those things, and also mention college. Is that something that's going to help, or is it really not going to matter?
So college does help. And we saw, and I put a blog post up on this not too long ago, the Propel program for Delta. I actually just changed some things in it recently. And what they changed was that it's going to be for ABI, the accrediting agency for collegiate aviation, only schools. And they made it only for CFIs working at those schools who they expect are within 12 months of meeting their ATP minimums. So we look back a couple of years ago, that Delta Propel program was taking folks that were freshmen and sophomores, getting them in, and they were a long hiring process, right? I mean, they're kind of in, we're going to skip the interview, you're going to go to Endeavor. My gosh, for Delta, that's a long commitment to these folks, and some of them are falling out of the process. So Delta kind of tightened that program up. And unless you're coming from one of those colleges, or they do actually have a few other partner schools that they work with, you are not going to be eligible for that Delta Propel program. And that's one example. All of the Pathways programs have their unique characteristics that you want to pay attention to. Some of those are only eligible for people going through collegiate aviation programs. We do have a general sense that the airlines favorably look at people who've come through career focused training aviation programs at the colleges and universities. It boils down to you've made it through that hurdle, right? You've kind of proven yourself. You're able to do that as a person that's kind of showing you've got the stick to it to get all the way through that. And you'll probably be a reasonably good bet for them as an airline that you're going to make it through their training. And that's really what they're looking for when they're hiring people. Do you have what it takes to get through our training, enter service as a professional pilot, and whatever it happens to be, whether it's a 141 that's looking for people to instruct for them, whether it's a 135 who's hiring those instructors to be pilots for them, whether it's NetJets, Delta Airlines, United Airlines. They want to be able to hire somebody that's going to make it through their training, enter service, be a good FO maybe first, and then eventually transition to being a captain. So they're going to have a long service out of this pilot. They're investing in that person by hiring them, giving them training, and they want to make sure that they're going to go work for that company for a while. It was interesting a few years ago, a friend of mine said for Spirit Airlines, and we know they're having some challenges right now, that almost never would a pilot get an interview request granted if they didn't show up at one of the in-person hiring fairs. And typically, they didn't get an interview until they'd showed up at two of those, because it kind of showed, hey, you really want to do this. And as a matter of fact, he said a couple of the recruiters he talked to said, if you showed up for that interview fair and it said, I want to work for any airline, you had checked off every single box. I want to work for this airline and that airline, and well, maybe if Spirit hires me, I'll do it. And it kind of got shuffled off. If you showed up and your interest sheet said, I want to work for Spirit Airlines, and that's all it said, and then you showed up to two of those in a row, they kind of looked at it as, all right, well, you want to work for us, right? And there's something to be said for that. I've got a good friend of mine. He's at 28 years old now. I did check rides for him, got to know him. He's at United, and he knew when he started his training at Western Michigan University, I want to go to United. And he made it happen, right? So he crafted his career path to make sure he did everything he needed to do to end up into that United hiring pool and got there. And that's part of the message of the book, is figure out what it's going to take in your pathway if you know where you want to end up to get there. And that can be whether you're 18 or 55. And people say that, my God, nobody's going to hire a 55-year-old airline guy. Boy, I know a guy who's an accountant, did a pretty good job, retired early, and said, I want to go fly for an airline. And he's flying for a regional airline. He'll probably stay at that regional airline, be a captain there, and fly till he's 65 and have a pretty cool second career, having some fun out of it. So, thinking how you get through that, what makes you stand out, is a big piece of getting hired in any professional aviation job.
I think one of the other benefits of going the college route is just furloughs are a fact of the industry. If you start a 40-year career, there's a good chance you're going to hit a furlough. If you've done some college, that probably enhances the ability to come up with a backup career that you might have to pursue for 2, 3, 5 years until the hiring starts up again. In fact, I know a lot of folks that keep side jobs even while they are actively working. My wife's cousin is very active in real estate, which he does on the days that he's not flying.
I joke the senior airline captain is the world's best part-time job, right? Most of these guys are flying 7 to 9 days a month, and you got to do something to keep yourself active on the side too. And I joke with that because we do all put our time in to get to those points, right? The early years can be tough, and we've seen furloughs happen. We've seen changes in the industry happen. Obviously we mentioned Spirit here. A lot of those pilots are looking for different jobs right now. We've seen mergers, acquisitions, all this stuff. One of the things you really just need to do is be a little bit flexible. And I'll tell you, a little humbleness goes a long way. We're doing a really cool job by flying airplanes around. I was actually down in the Bahamas back in December, and we had 2 pilots at the resort with us. And it was interesting because the mindset of the 2 of them was completely different. One of them, as I sat and talked, said, man, I don't even know why I'm still doing this job, this stupid Pilatus job. I got my application into JetBlue, and I don't know why they haven't hired me yet. Wow. I sat and talked to the other pilot. He said, man, what a cool job. I get to fly a Pilatus around the Bahamas. Yeah, okay, I got to drop some people off here and there, right? And this is somebody who's, he's worked his butt off to get to that job, and there's a lot of flight instructors out there building time right now. If you called them and told them, you want a job flying a Pilatus around the Bahamas? They would jump at it and be all in, right? And the other guy's, his mindset was wrong. He's be a little bit humble, a little happy to do what we're doing. This is pretty neat. We're not digging ditches. If you get knocked down at some point in your career, you're flying for a corporate operator and they say, hey, I think I'm going to sell the jet. You're going to find another job, right? Yeah, you might take a little financial hit here and there, and some financial planning goes a long ways in everybody's life, right? Make sure you got that backup plan if you do end up out of a job for 6 months, but be willing to go and figure out where the jobs are and work with that. And that might mean sometimes moving, unfortunately, too. And this is, we're a transport business, we're a transport job. And one of the best pieces of advice you can always give somebody is live near your base, especially for your first few years. But a lot of folks have jobs, you might be a remote operated pilot for NetJets. You might not live in Columbus. You might be somewhere else and commute in and out. Well, if that job goes away, it might be time to start looking for some other ones. And being a little bit flexible goes a long ways, especially if we're going to have any ups and downs in the industry. I joke with people, the best advice I can give you is don't get a dog, don't get a house, don't get married, don't have kids in your first 5 years. And I say that not because none of these things are good, but the more flexible you are, if somebody says, hey, do you want a job in Kansas City? Well, I live in, Detroit, but if the job's in Kansas City, maybe I'll do it for a few years and gain that experience, gain that flight time. And if you put yourself in the position to do that later in life, you'll have more ability to command your own future where you want to go.
Talk about good experience in general. What kind of experiences should people be looking for to try and differentiate themselves when they show up at their interview?
So it's a good question, and any experience is better than none, right? Anything you can do to build some more real-world flying experience. I'll tell you, I had an opportunity when I was a young pilot. I had just finished my commercial certificate, and my old flight instructor, his son, actually flew for a Part 135 operation. And I rode a few flights with them that, when they had the weight and balance capability, there was an aeromedical flight transport company that flew him in at Chieftain, and I didn't get to log any time, and but it was sure wonderful experience. Find opportunities that you can, even if you're not necessarily logging time, make some mentor connections and find ways to be around some of those flights and learn from them. If you get a chance to hop on a flight with somebody, do it. Even if it's other folks at the airport, if somebody's going flying, you can hop in and take a ride. Definitely extreme value in flying less local flights, the more non-local. If you can get out and fly places with people, you never know what you're going to encounter. And certainly there's value in flying as a flight instructor, gaining that local experience, working with students, learning to teach. Crew resource management is certainly happening while you're an instructor, but bolster that with whatever other experience you can get. Also, if there's things you can ride along, there's volunteer organizations that you may be able to get to go with. I've done a lot of Wings of Mercy trips, and every time you go somewhere, like you said, you learn something. Of a friend at a major cargo carrier says every flight they assume 2.5 things have gone wrong, right? And then how do they manage it? So no flight is perfect. It might be something as simple as, wow, a gauge is doing something weird. How do I manage that? I was on a check ride the other day, and we're climbing out, and I'll be darned, the alternator light popped on the old Warrior we were in. And, so the applicant did a good job, grabbed her checklist, went through it, recycled the alternator, and it worked the rest of the flight. Well, that something happened, right? You're learning from this stuff. That gave that person a story that they can tell on an interview of, well, I was on my check ride and I don't think the examiner did anything. And I didn't, because I had no idea why it went off either. We also don't know why it worked the rest of the flight, but she was able to say, I went through my checklist, I did it, and I had a plan. If it didn't work, we were going back to the airport. So, the more times you can get some real life flying experience, the better. And I got to say, solo flying is valuable too. I know it's not cheap to do this stuff, but we're seeing a lot of people come out with 10 or 12 total hours of solo time before they get to their CFI, and that's it, because we're so focused on getting the lessons done, getting through the ratings and certificates. Have a little fun. Go out and fly the airplane, and I know that's costly, but every time you go flying solo, it's going to build a little bit more confidence in your flying as well.
Yeah, you get a lot of good experience on those trips that you just don't get when you're staying within 50 miles of the local airport. Well, in terms of good experience, my first career was working for Hewlett-Packard. One of my colleagues was Bill Lewis, who became a DPE up in Michigan. And back in his days working for HP, he would at night go fly right seat in a Citation on some type of charter or something. I don't know exactly what it was. I thought he was a little bit crazy because he would then show up the next morning a little bit tired. But I think he probably got so much experience from that, and he absolutely loved it. And I'm sure he got a million stories out of it as well.
and you get to work with other folks. So anytime you do that, right, you're building that relationship in a flight deck with somebody else, the communication. Even if it's just riding along with them and working radios, you're going to get familiar with different ways of doing this. You might learn different avionics systems. You might get to go, wow, I haven't been in a really busy airport like whatever one you're going to, and figuring out how to get a clearance and working through ground and all of these things. Every time you do this, you're gaining some more experience. It might be learning to taxi at a busier airport. It might be working with an FBO to make sure the aircraft got fueled properly. All of these things build experience. So yeah, jumping in late at night might make you a little tired for the day job, and you got to plan for this. But just being somebody in that flight deck, gaining experience, whether you're the PIC or a passenger who's helping, does help. So anywhere you can get experience is going to help you in that career path.
Let's talk a little bit about logbooks. I know that those are very important. Talk about what pilots should be thinking about now as they're working on their logbooks prior to an interview for some type of professional flying job.
So what I will tell you, I kind of take the logbook question to almost paranoid schizophrenia level. Your logbook is your career tracking, and you're going to need to present this to somebody at a hiring place for a professional job option if you want a career in flying. I had somebody not too long ago on a check ride show up, and there was this Ziploc bag. And she kind of was almost a little teary, and she said, I got to tell you, my dog got to my logbook. I mean, not joking, right? The cover it was shredded, the back. Fortunately, it didn't get anything inside of it because she got to them. I've seen, people left it in my car and the sunroof was open and it got soaked. And, matter of fact, I've got a check ride coming up that was somebody who's mid-career, and he's like, I have no idea where my logbooks went. I don't know where my complex endorsement is because I moved 3 times. Fortunately, he found it. But these are really critical things. You need to protect that logbook. When I say protect it, have a physical logbook, have a digital logbook, make them match each other so the times come out the same. And what I really tell a lot of folks is make backups of this. And I'll tell you, I basically use a scanner app on my phone. Every time I finish a page, I take a picture, dump it into a PDF, and that one lives in Dropbox. That way, if my computer barfs, I've got a backup digitally. I have my originals, I have those. So you're going to need to present this. And there's nothing wrong with presenting really good scans of it and a digital when you go to an interview. Be able to show, where your flight times come from, document it, and have a good presentation. And there are folks out there, companies that do logbook presentations. They'll help quantify all this, build a nice binder. You want to present yourself in the best way possible. This is kind of your curricula vitae. It's your show and tell of why are you a good pilot. And boy, showing up with the dog chewed one isn't going to give you a real good, step off image here. She has gone out and scanned it and made copies and made a really nice looking packet now, and probably will never leave her logbook anywhere near a dog again. So, that logbook is really important, and that's part of your career path because this is documenting what it's going to take to make you eligible for hiring. And if you get to the point where you're looking at a job interview for anything and there are minimum times requirements, make sure you've gone through those logbooks and carefully made sure things are totaled up properly and matched. I'm going to tell you my personal practice is every time I finish a logbook page, I'm a little old school. My digital is a spreadsheet, but there's lots of cool stuff, lots of places out there you can use. I make sure my spreadsheet and my logbook match before I put totals on the bottom of that page. And it is very frequent when I'm going through this that I find mismatches. Oops, I forgot to put that in the high performance column, or that was cross country and I didn't put it in there. Make them match, make them clean, so your pages are going to carry forward, and you're going to be putting the best foot forward at any professional interview for a pilot.
And quickly, how would you recommend people make corrections when they have to cross something out in the logbook?
So the best way to make corrections is to put a line through it, initial it, and make the correction. For anybody who's had an accounting class, I treat this by like what we call adjusting entries. So if you go back 4 or 5 pages and find something, you don't want to go back and put whiteout on all those pages. What you'll do is it might be a minus 0.5, a plus 0.5, put a note, corrected for each line in that logbook. Doesn't have to be used for a separate flight. You could say, look, here's the date. It's today's 2/3/2026. I put a line in it and say, making correcting entry in my remarks section, plus 0.5, minus 0.5 to these columns. and then carry it forward. So it's clear what the correction has been made, and you're not just putting a bunch of scribble outs. I mean, God, there's a spot in my original logbook where I just put a big black marker through it because it was wrong. And it looks bad when I look back in that first logbook, but 17-year-old Jason didn't know any better. So learn from 17-year-old Jason and make your correcting entries visible, clear, understandable, and professional looking.
So we talked earlier about money, but let's talk about financing. What should people know about trying to finance their flight training?
You know, there's a ski industry guy named Warren Miller that he used to say in his movies, anytime he'd come up with some cool place people would ski, he'd basically say, go this year, because if you don't do it this year, you'll just be 1 year older when you do. I've modified that to say, if you don't do it now, it's just going to get more expensive, right? So flying in my career, and I'm sure yours, hasn't gotten cheaper. You know, we talked to the old folks that were like, my $100 check ride, my $18 an hour Cessna 150 time. And we think, boy, wouldn't that be great, right? It is expensive. We know that. It's not getting cheaper. You know, airplane gas goes up, airplanes are expensive, all this stuff gets expensive. And sometimes that means we've got to finance our training. Not everybody can shell out $60,000, $70,000 to get all the way through their training path right away, or even a couple $100,000 if we're going to go through university programs and all of our training. It means planning ahead. There are companies that will finance your training, especially at some of the academy style programs, and that may be an option for you. A crazy idea is also save up, right, Max? Especially if you're doing this midlife career thing, you might make some really hard decisions for a while and eat a little less out, great dinners, maybe even, you know, have a smaller house or apartment for a while for a couple of years, or you buy the used car, not the new one, and you save some money up. That's an option too. And self-finance your training so you're not incurring the costs of interest on that. A lot of folks go through the colleges and they work through student loan programs. The key there is in all of these, if you're financing and understand what the terms of those financing are, understand when your paybacks are going to start, and make sure you're going to be in a position that you will be able to make that payback happen. What I will say is I've worked with a few of the college students, and the ones that are pretty fastidious, boy, some of the bonuses and stuff that are getting paid for some of these jobs, it doesn't take very long for them to pay back all of their student loans, you know. So you finish your college, you work as a CFI for a little while, and you've got, you know, $80,000, $90,000 in debt. Might be the first 2 years of your job at the regional airline, the bonuses will pay for that. So instead of going out and buying that brand new, you know, Maserati with that bonus, maybe it's time to hold that buckle a little bit tight for a couple of years and pay that off and put yourself in a position to really be, you know, out of debt and ahead of that. So, you know, anytime you're going to finance stuff, just think about what's the way to get out of that debt, but it doesn't mean it's a bad investment. I mean, some of these are wonderful investments. And if you need to finance things to get where you want to, it really is still one of the best paybacks in terms of career anywhere that we have, unless you happen to come up with a new drink umbrella that's the multi-billion-dollar idea. This is one of the best payback career paths there is.
Yeah, in terms of financing, I think one of the critical mistakes people make sometimes is they start taking lessons before they have all of the money available to finish the particular certificate or rating that they're on. And that then means they've got to stop, they've got to wait, they've got to make more money. And then they're going to end up repeating some of the lessons that they've done because they will have forgotten in those 6 months or whatever that gap was. So I think it's far more efficient. It's going to take you fewer hours to get a certificate if you have all that money ahead of time, or if you know exactly where that money is coming from ahead of time. So be patient. Wait till you've got the money lined up before you start these ratings.
And I would build a contingency into that, you know, put maybe 20% extra on top of that, because, you know, here we are in Michigan and you and I are talking on a snowy day, which means somebody's not getting their check ride today, right? Because I would have been doing one otherwise. And what that means is I'm not doing it today. And, you know, if we get stuck a week or two, well, they're going to probably want another proficiency flight before we go do that check ride. So plan for those contingencies. Also give yourself a little bit of a slush factor on top of it in case you get delayed for weather. You know, I had a student a couple of years ago was working a waitressing job and tripped and ran a stem of a glass through her hand. Oh my God. Right. Well, that definitely held up her training for a little bit. You know, she got back to it, but she had to get back to, you know, getting proficient again after 2 months. So, you know, life happens, and build for those contingencies also. Don't count down to that last dollar for the check ride, because it might be something as simple as the airplane broke on that day. and you just didn't get it done. And I've seen a lot of folks fall out of training simply because they couldn't finish it financially. And that's really sad to see. And they've put a lot of time and money into it. And we want to see you guys get through it.
Tell us about some of the other book titles that you've written that are also available through ASA.
Sure. I think the one that most folks are looking at is the Oral Exam Guide series now. We've done an update on that. Originally, that was written by somebody else, and he retired out. And so I got the opportunity to help ASA keep those books up to date. So we've got them out for the instrument and the commercial and the private. The ATP is coming. The CFI is coming soon under my edits. And we've got a flight review one and a multi-engine out there. So what we did with those, and originally ASA did it, is to try and create a whole bunch of questions that are commonly found on the practical tests that folks might run into. It doesn't mean you're going to get those exact questions, but it means that you're going to have a bunch of questions to help you study, help you prepare, and understand especially the scenario process that happens on the practical tests. A couple other books out there on buying and owning airplanes, a tailwheel book, and a middle altitude book, and certainly have very much appreciated the opportunity from ASA to keep putting things out. And this was a new book. We really kind of looked forward to putting the Pilot Career Path book out and focused on what it takes to get through the training path to a professional aviation flying job. There is a website that goes with it, thepilotcareerpath.com, where some of the content that didn't fit in the size of the book and some FAQ questions and stuff are out there also. I encourage folks to check that out, especially if you're looking at this as a career path, is it changing to a path, or even if you're a parent who might have a son or daughter who's looking at the professional pilot career path. You might find some things in there that would help you at least have discussions and plan. And I can't tell you any one thing is going to give you the answer to every piece of the path, but it's really important that as you go through that career pilot training path, that you have discussions, think about what's going to best fit for you and help you get to that end job you're looking for most efficiently without wasting time and money along the way.
Well, the book is An Aviator's Field Guide to the Pilot Career Path. You can find it at ASA2fly.com. And of course, all of your other books are available there as well. And I do want to say that I have always recommended the oral exam guides for many, many years, and I've used them myself. They are a fabulous resource for people who are planning to take a check ride. Jason, thanks so much for all the things that you do, and thanks for being with us here today.
Glad to be here, and may it stop snowing in Michigan so I can go back to flying.
And my thanks to Jason for joining us here today. You can find more about him and his work at jasonblair.net. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.